Hi, in this lecture I want to give you some answers about designing iOS apps. There's a lot of confusion out there and for good reasons. Things are complicated. I'll do my best to simplify it. Let me start with the conclusions. 1. I don't worry about the notch. It's not a factor in my book and I think you shouldn't waste energy on it. 2. Your artboard size, be it in Photoshop or Adobe XD, should be 375 by 667 pixels. 3. Don't worry about transforming pixels to points or vice versa. We have Zeppelin for that. So these are the conclusions of this lecture. Now I'll go into more depth, starting with number 1. The notch imposes several design problems, but here's why I think it's not worth worrying about it. The main reason may surprise you, but it's actually the Samsung Galaxy S10. This has a huge screen-to-body ratio, but notice it's not using a notch. It has a hole for the camera in the top right side, but that's about it. This tells us that the notch is not here to stay. It's highly unlikely we'll find it in another generation of iPhones. For that reason alone, learning about its peculiarities doesn't seem like time well spent. That's part 2 of my reasoning. Time. We need to design fantastic iOS apps. What percentage would you give the notch to that end? What impact does it have on our designs? 50%? 10%? 5%? While I can't say a definitive number, it's definitely in the 1-digit area, meaning it's inconsequential. If your app looks great, it's going to look that way with or without the notch. Don't waste your time on it. Sure, we won't disregard it completely and we'll use some guides and templates to help us out, but no, it's not an important factor. Number 2, the artboard size and the age-old 1 times, 2 times, 3 times question. First, 375 points is the width of the iPhone 6, 7, 8, X and XS. You can double-check that in Adobe XD. Leaving points and pixels aside, if all these phones have the same width and the only thing that changes is the height, then that doesn't affect us in any significant way. So if you're designing for the iPhone X, you simply have to have more room for content. Our UI elements don't get stretched out, so you won't get nasty aspect ratios as far as your user interface elements are concerned. Things like full-screen images do get cropped, but it's honestly not a big deal. For that reason, we're golden. We can work at 375 by 667, which is considered 1 times. The entire app will use that value. We won't create multiple versions unless instructed otherwise, though even then I'd question the reasoning behind it as it doesn't help anyone in any significant way. We'll always use vectors to design our apps, whether it's in Photoshop or Adobe XD. Both programs have the ability to export everything at 2 times and 3 times. Now you may say that size is too small, and I somewhat agree, but here's the scoop. 2 times means 750 by 1334 pixels, which is a very popular resolution for iPhones. While you could design at that size, most designers don't approve of this method. That's because from 2 times to 3 times, you'd have to scale your elements to 150%. This sometimes produces imperfect, pixelated results. The consensus is that going from 100% to 2 and 300% is much better, especially if you're using Photoshop. Moving on, as with any project, you won't be forced to give all of these resources to your iOS developers manually. You'll use Zeppelin, which will provide all 3 sizes as well as measurements in points. More than that, Zeppelin will provide code in both Objective-C and Swift, depending on what the coder uses, so that's a load off your mind as far as points are concerned. You may want to show off and design at 3 times and then use Zeppelin to produce 2 times and 1 times. That sounds like a great idea, but 3 times means one single artboard is going to be 1125 by 2436 pixels. Considering any serious app project has tens of screens, you'll have serious performance problems as well as real estate issues. Know that it can be done if you're using a state-of-the-art workstation and a 5K display. In that scenario, you can design directly at 3 times, but most people don't have this luxury. Thus, 1 times at 375 by 667 is the recommended way to go. By the way, we have an entire section on Zeppelin, so be sure to check it out. Considering all this, you don't need to know about the history of points and pixels and the struggle it entails. If you've followed the Android part, it's something similar to DP and SP. One final thing before we go. I said most regular iPhones have the same width, 375. But what about plus-size models? What do we do with those? Well, those have a width of 414 points, but what's great is that the aspect ratio is the same. To test it out, have both artboards open somewhere, say in Adobe XD, then create a rectangle as big as the first artboard. Then create a copy and resize it. Use Shift to constrain its aspect ratio. What you'll find is that it scales perfectly. Thus, you don't need to worry about making lots of versions of the same app. One size is enough. And with that, let's take a break.